The wind howled across Coldspire Ridge like a starving beast, hurling itself against the lone cabin where Daniel Clarke dragged a half-frozen deer through the snow. He moved with the raw power of a man carved from timber and storms. His body huge, broad-chested, muscles coiled under layers of buckskin and fur, looked built not by training, but by the unforgiving mountain itself. Long dark hair whipped around a face both rugged and arrestingly handsome, framed by a thick winter beard that failed to hide the sharp cut of his jaw. His shoulders seemed too wide for the cabin door. His arms, thick and sinewed, bore scars like pale lightning against sun-burnished skin. The people of Frost Hollow called him the Bearman. Standing there towering, wild, breath steaming in the cold, it wasn't hard to see why. Daniel kicked the door shut, the fire catching on the glint of an empty whiskey bottle. He lived alone, spoke to no one, trusted nothing but silence. So the fact that he could still hear a woman's terrified scream riding the storm wind felt impossible, and yet he heard it. Coldspire Ridge rose in jagged slabs across the Montana sky, a wall of stone and ice that swallowed sound and light with the same cold indifference. Snow clung to the pines in heavy white crescents, bowing their spines toward the frozen ground. The air tasted of iron and pine. The wind moved like a warning, sharp enough to cut through wool and bone. Down in Frost Hollow, folks whispered that anyone who chose to live on that ridge had either lost their mind or lost everything else first. Daniel Clarke had lost everything. Inside his cabin, the warmth of the fire did little to soften the harsh lines carved into his face. He hoisted the deer carcass from the floor, muscles shifting beneath his shirt like coiled cables. 10 years earlier, those same hands had built a small wooden house in Kansas, a home crafted board by board, full of promise. He had hammered every nail with hope, sanding each beam smooth so the woman he loved could touch it without fear of splinters. She had been carrying their first child. Daniel remembered the glow in her eyes when she rested her palm on her belly and said, "Our baby will have sunlight in their walls." But sunlight had nothing to do with what happened next. The night her pain began, Daniel rode through mud and darkness to fetch the town doctor. Walter Claiborne had looked at her, barely listened, then pressed a vial of opium-heavy painkiller into Daniel's hand. "First births are messy," Claiborne said. "Give her this. Let God do the rest." By dawn, the praying had done nothing. His wife died in his arms, his unborn child with her, both gone before the sun fully rose. Daniel buried them himself, hands shaking as he dug into the frozen ground, the cold earth biting at his fingers. No one helped. No one knew what to say to the man whose world had collapsed overnight. When the funeral ended, Claiborne approached with hollow sympathy and cowardice disguised as faith. "It was God's will," he said. "I cannot be held responsible for these tragedies." Daniel didn't remember the doctor's face, only the intense rage that burned inside him like a wildfire. That night, he returned to the house he had built, the house meant for a family that never got to live in it. He placed the wooden animals he had carved for the baby on the porch steps. Wolves, rabbits, deer, each one a tiny piece of a life he would never hold. Then he lit a match and walked away from the world. 10 years on Coldspire Ridge had turned him into something massive, untamed. His beard was thick and wild, his hair long and ungoverned. His shoulders were broader than most men's courage. Scars ran across his arms in pale, jagged lines marks left by axes, falling branches, hungry winters, and a life spent trying to outrun grief. Folks called him the Bearman, and it suited him. He lived like a creature shaped by storms and silence. Daniel poured the last of his whiskey into a tin cup. The burn steadied him. Outside, the wind dragged icy fingers along the cabin walls, making them groan like living things. And then he heard it, a sound too thin for the wind, too desperate to be an animal, a woman's cry, miles away, half buried in the rising storm. Rose Merriweather clung to her panicked horse. She was a young woman of soft curves and gentle presence, someone whose warmth usually belonged near a hearth, not on a mountain meant to swallow wanderers whole. Her long brown hair whipped behind her as the snow clawed at her cheeks. Her breath came in sharp, terrified bursts. She had fled humiliation, heartbreak still burning on her skin, never imagining the storm would trap her. Nor could she know that the man fate was leading her toward had sworn he would never save another human soul again. But the mountain didn't care, and neither, it seemed, did destiny. The storm thickened as Daniel stepped out into the wind, the cry he'd heard still echoing in his ears. Snow slapped against his face, needling through his beard. For a moment he stood there, massive and unmoving, wondering if grief had finally reshaped his senses. But then the sound came again, fragmented, fading, undeniably human. Daniel clenched his jaw, grabbed his coat, and pushed into the blizzard. He moved like a man who knew the mountain's every mood. His boots broke through drifts, icy branches scraped across his arms. Through the blur of white, he spotted a frantic shape, a horse plunging sideways, its reins tangled in a broken branch. A woman hung from the saddle, slipping, her body limp with exhaustion. One more gust would hurl her into the ravine. Daniel lunged forward and caught her just as her fingers slipped free. The horse bolted. The storm swallowed it whole. The woman sagged against Daniel's chest, breath shallow, lashes crusted with frost. She was warm in places, dangerously cold in others, her skirts frozen stiff. Daniel lifted her as though she weighed nothing, feeling the faintest tremor run through her body. Her head fell against his shoulder, long strands of hair sticking to the fur lining of his coat. She murmured something soft, broken before the wind stole the rest. "It's all right," Daniel muttered, though he wasn't sure if the words were for her or the ghost of the past pressing against his ribs. He carried her up the ridge, each step carving deep into the snow. The cabin door slammed behind them, the fire's glow pushing back the storm's claws. Daniel set her down near the hearth. For the briefest moment, he simply stared. She was a woman unlike any he'd seen in a decade. Her features gentle even in fear, her cheeks still round despite the cold, her lips trembling with the first signs of waking. Her hair spilled across the rug, thick and dark, warming in the fire's glow. It struck him then, with a strange force, how long it had been since he'd seen softness anywhere but in memory. He tore his gaze away. Her clothes were soaked through. If he didn't act, she would die the way his wife had, helpless in his hands. Daniel forced himself into motion, stripping away the frozen layers with a mixture of urgency and restraint. When he wrapped her in blankets and rubbed warmth back into her limbs, he did so with the steady ruthlessness of a man who refused to lose another life. Her eyelids fluttered. A small gasp escaped her. Then she woke. She jolted upright, clutching the blanket to her chest, her eyes wide, dark, and frightened fixed on him. The air went tight between them. Daniel stepped back, raising his hands slightly, palms open. "You're safe," he said. His voice, deep and unused to gentleness, sounded harsher than he intended. The woman swallowed hard. Where am I? Coldspire Ridge, my cabin. You were freezing to death in the storm. She absorbed his words slowly. Her gaze flickered across the room, the drying dress near the fire, the wooden beams, the scars on Daniel's arms, and something like fear settled beneath her ribs. You undressed me. It wasn't an accusation, just shock truth. Daniel nodded once. Wet clothes kill faster than cold. I did what was needed. Her grip on the blanket eased, barely. She studied him more carefully now, the wilderness of his beard, the breadth of his shoulders, the intensity in his eyes. Everything about him radiated danger, yes, but none of it pointed toward cruelty. What's your name? She asked after a long silence. Daniel Clarke. She hesitated, breath trembling. I'm Rose. Rose Merriweather. A spark of awareness shifted between them, not warmth. Not yet, but recognition. Two people forced together by the storm, both carrying the weight of lives they hadn't meant to flee into the snow. Daniel gestured toward the fire. Rest. The storm hasn't finished with us yet. Their eyes met again, briefly, sharply, and just like that, the mountain that had swallowed Daniel's world whole brought a stranger into his cabin, a woman whose presence unsettled him in ways even the dead never had. The storm did not lift the next day, nor the day after. Snow piled against the cabin walls in drifts that reached Daniel's waist. Wind screamed through the chinks in the logs like a restless spirit. Inside, the world narrowed to the crackle of burning wood and the uneasy quiet between two strangers who suddenly shared the same roof. Rose Merriweather tried not to stare, but it was impossible. Daniel Clarke moved through the cabin like some great mountain animal, silent, heavy-footed, his presence taking up all the air around him. When he stoked the fire, the muscles in his back shifted beneath his shirt as if carved from stone. When he spoke, the cabin seemed to tighten around the low rumble of his voice. He was nothing like the men she had known in Frost Hollow. Those men were polished, careful, defined by manners and social grace. Daniel was something far older, shaped by storms and solitude. Yet he had saved her life. And now, they were trapped together. Rose wrapped the blanket tighter around her as she sat by the fire. Her clothes, washed and drying, hung neatly on a wooden rack. Daniel walked past her with a bundle of firewood on one shoulder, his movements economical, as if every step had a purpose. You should eat. He set a bowl of stew beside her. Venison, herbs, the steam fragrant and warm. Rose hesitated. Thank you. He didn't answer. Daniel simply returned to cutting wood at the corner of the cabin, the rhythmic thunk of the blade filling the silence between them. Snow fell harder outside. The storm had no intention of letting her leave. A long moment passed before Rose spoke again. I can help. You know. Daniel stopped mid-swing, looked up with a frown. Help with chores. With something. She pushed a strand of hair behind her ear. I don't want to sit here useless. His gaze flicked over her soft hands, gentle face. A woman used to warmth in kitchens, not mountains and knives. You're not useless, he said, turning back to the wood. You're recovering. Still. He didn't stop her when she rose to try. Rose followed him outside later that morning, stepping into snow almost up to her knees, cold bit at her toes. And she nearly lost balance when the wind shoved her sideways. Daniel caught her by the elbow, his hand warm and unhesitating. You'll freeze, he muttered. I won't, she insisted, breath fogging. Just show me what to do. So he did. He taught her how to stack the split logs so moisture wouldn't seep in. He handed her the smaller pieces kindling and showed her the right angle to strike with the hatchet. At first, Rose could barely crack the wood. The blade bounced, jarring her arms. She grimaced. Daniel watched silently, expression unreadable. "Again," he said. She tried, missed, tried again. A thin crack split the surface. When she finally managed to break a small log cleanly, the pride that lit her face was so bright it startled him. Rose looked at Daniel, eyes shining with triumph. He felt something unfamiliar tug at his chest. "You did it," he said before he could stop himself. Her smile grew. "Maybe I just needed the right teacher." Daniel looked away quickly, uncomfortable with the warmth that bloomed in his ribs. Back inside, she insisted on tending the fire. She learned the way he liked the coals arranged, the way he kicked snow off his boots before entering, the way he frowned when the wind shook the shutters. In return, he learned the sound of her laughter, soft and surprised, like a bell warmed by sunlight, and the way her cheeks flushed when she concentrated. By the third morning, the rhythm between them felt almost natural. Daniel checked his traps. Rose prepared coffee. When he returned cold and dusted with snow, she met him at the door with a towel. "You were gone longer today," she said, the faintest edge of worry in her tone. Daniel stilled. No one had worried for him in 10 years. It unsettled him more than the storm outside. "I'm fine," he said quietly. Rose looked up, eyes soft. "I know, but I still care." The words landed in him like a blow, sharp, unexpected. Daniel turned away before she could see how deeply they struck. That evening, as Rose practiced whittling beside the fire, her knife slipped and nicked her thumb. She winced, dropping the wood. Daniel was at her side in 2 long strides. "Let me see." "It's nothing," she murmured. He ignored her. His hands dwarfed hers, rough palms cupping her soft fingers with surprising gentleness. The cut was small, but a bead of blood rose. His chest tightened unexpectedly. He wrapped it in a strip of cloth, movements careful, almost reverent. When he finished, he realized Rose was watching him not with fear now, but with something warmer, something he did not know how to name. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel dropped her hand as if it burned. "You should rest." But Rose didn't move away. "Daniel, you don't have to be alone in everything." Her voice was low, fragile, yet certain. The fire cast gold across her face, softening every line. For the first time in 10 years, Daniel felt truly seen, and it terrified him. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, something gentler had begun to take shape. Neither of them spoke of it, but both felt the shift, the quiet pull drawing them closer, day by day, breath by breath. The 5th morning broke under a sky the color of bruised steel. Though the storm had weakened, the ridge remained suffocatingly silent, too silent for Rose, who woke with a strange tightness in her chest. Daniel had left before sunrise. His empty boots stood by the door like sentinels. The cabin felt colder without the massive shape of him moving inside it. Rose wrapped herself in a blanket and approached the fire, her thumb still bearing the tiny cut Daniel had wrapped so carefully throbbed faintly. She pressed it to her lips, telling herself it was only the cold making her heart beat faster. A sudden knock shattered the quiet. Not a soft touch, a demand. Daniel Rose called, stepping toward the door. Another blow, the wood groaned on its hinges. Rose froze. Before she could reach the latch, the door burst open, snow spiraling inward in a violent gust. Victor Danehill stood framed by the storm. His once elegant coat hung crooked on his shoulders, dusted with ice. His hair, usually slicked with pomade, was wind-whipped and wild, but his eyes sharp, pale, and filled with spite were exactly as she remembered them from the night she fled Frost Hollow's Christmas feast. "There you are," he hissed, stepping inside, slamming the door behind him. Hiding in a shack like some shameful little runaway. Rose instinctively backed away, her breath fogged in uneven bursts. "Victor, you shouldn't be here. I shouldn't." He barked a laugh. "You humiliate me in front of half the town, run off like a deranged child, and I shouldn't be here." He advanced. The memories hit her like a thrown stone, the glow of lanterns, the scent of turkey she'd lovingly basted with her mother, her green dress fitting just right, her cheeks warm with pride and hope. Then Victor's voice sharp enough to wound. "Look at you," he had sneered at the table, gesturing at her plate. "My future wife can't help herself in front of food. At this rate, she'll double in size before spring." Gasps, whispers, heat flooding her face. And then the cutting blow. "Try not to devour half the table next time, Rose. God forbid my bride is the joke of the town." That was when she ran, when she mounted her horse and fled into the cold, into the storm, into Daniel's world. Now Victor's hand closed around her wrist with that same cruel certainty. "You're coming with me," he snapped, pulling her closer. "Your parents agreed to this marriage. You embarrassed me, Rose, and you'll fix it." "You're hurting me," she whispered, struggling against his grip. "I've indulged your softness long enough," he spat. "No wonder you ran off and collapsed in the snow. A woman like you isn't built for much else." Rose gasped, eyes stinging. His words sliced through her, reopening every wound he'd caused. Victor yanked harder. "Get your things. You will walk out with me." The door slammed open for the second time that morning. Daniel filled the entrance. Snow dusted his hair. His coat hung heavy on his shoulders. His chest rose and fell with the controlled breath of a man who had walked quickly and grown angrier with every step. His gaze swept the cabin. Rose, Victor, their locked wrists. Something primal ignited behind his dark eyes. He stepped inside, shutting out the wind with a quiet finality that made the floor seem to tilt. "Why?" Daniel said, voice low enough to rattle the fire irons. "Are you trespassing in my cabin?" Victor dropped Rose's wrist as if burned. "Mr. Clarke," he stammered, I was simply retrieving what belongs to me." Daniel's jaw tightened. He moved forward, each step deliberate. "She does not belong to you." Victor tried to straighten his coat, failing to hide the tremble in his fingers. Her parents promised her. Daniel seized him by the collar, dragging him off balance with terrifying ease. He slammed Victor against the wall, the log shuddering with the impact. "You touch her again," Daniel growled, "and you won't walk out of here." Victor's voice cracked. "You're insane." Daniel's fist drew back. Rose screamed, "Daniel, stop!" Her hands wrapped around his raised wrist, small and shaking. "Please, don't do this. Not for me. Don't become something you'll regret." Her voice soft. Trembling cut through the roar in Daniel's blood like a blade through cloth. Slowly, painfully, his fingers loosened. He released Victor, who collapsed onto the floor, scrambling awkwardly to his feet. "You both deserve each other," Victor spat. But the words were thin, brittle. "This isn't over." Daniel took a step forward. Victor fled without another word. When the door slammed shut behind him, silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It trembled, alive with everything unspoken. Rose leaned against Daniel's arm, breath shaking. "I didn't want him to turn you into someone you're not." Daniel looked down at her flushed cheeks, her frightened eyes, the bravery in her voice despite her trembling. His voice cracked on its way out. "I can't control myself around you. It wasn't a confession of danger. It was a confession of feeling raw, untamed, overwhelming. Rose's hand slid into his, her fingers soft and sure. "I know," she whispered, "and I'm not afraid." Outside, the last snow of winter began to fall. Inside the cabin, something new, something fragile and fierce had begun to take root between them, stronger than the storm that had brought them together. The morning after the confrontation dawned strangely quiet, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. The wind had finally died, leaving a sky washed pale by the aftertaste of winter. But inside the cabin, the air felt colder than it had at the height of the storm. Rose woke to the creak of floorboards and saw Daniel moving through the dim light with the heaviness of a man carrying something he couldn't put down. His back was to her, broad and unyielding, shoulders tense beneath his coat. There was a distance in the room thin as frost, sharp as a blade. She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket around her. "Daniel, are you all right?" He didn't turn. "We'll go down the ridge today." The words struck her like cold water, not cruel, but final. Rose lowered her gaze, brushing her fingers over the small cut on her thumb, the one he had bandaged with such careful hands. Now the cloth felt like a reminder of warmth he was trying so desperately to pull away from. "About yesterday," she whispered. "I'm sorry you had to see that. The things he said to me, the things he implied. I didn't want that ugliness in your home." "It wasn't your fault," Daniel said, still facing the door. But his voice was tight, controlled in a way she had come to recognize as pain. She stood, wrapping her arms around herself. "Victor has always had a talent for making me feel small. Last night, he tried to do the same. But you—" Her breath caught. How could she explain the way Daniel's fury had shaken her? Not with fear, but with a terrible understanding that someone else had finally cared enough to fight for her. "You stopped yourself," she said softly. "Because I asked you to." At that, Daniel finally turned, his eyes dark. Storm-worn met hers for a moment that felt like the space between a heartbeat and a confession. But then he stepped away. "Get dressed," he said quietly. "Your family is waiting." Rose's throat tightened. "Daniel, please don't shut me out." His jaw flexed, the muscles tightening along a line carved by years of grief. "I'm not shutting you out. I'm keeping you safe." From what she whispered, he looked at her, then not with anger, but with a sorrow weighted by a decade of loss. "From me." The words hit her so hard she felt her breath falter. Rose wanted to reach for him, to tell him he wasn't the monster he saw in himself, that the only time she had felt truly endangered in months was when Victor sneered at her during the Christmas feast. That Daniel's anger had never frightened her, the world's cruelty had. But Daniel had already turned away. The ride down the ridge was silent except for the crunch of snow beneath the horse's hooves. Rose sat in front of him, wrapped in his coat, feeling the steady warmth of his chest against her back. It should have comforted her, yet instead it carved a hollow ache inside her, because every breath brought her closer to losing him. When Frost Hollow came into view, lights glowing weakly through the morning fog, Rose felt a pull in her chest, stronger than fear, stronger than grief. Her home no longer felt like home. Eleanor and Howard Merriweather burst from their doorway the moment they saw her. Her mother collapsed into tears. Holding Rose so tightly, the world blurred around the edges. Her father's hands shook as they cupped her face, checking she was whole, alive. Rose clung to them, but her eyes searched for Daniel. He was already turning his horse around, silent, immense, the cold wind tangling through his hair. Howard stepped forward, voice trembling. "Mr. Clarke, thank you for bringing our daughter back." Daniel gave no reply, no nod, no glance. He simply rode away. Snow swirled behind him, a trail the wind would erase by noon. Rose watched until his figure disappeared into the trees. Her mother's warm arms wrapped around her, but they felt wrong somehow, as if her heart remained halfway up the mountain where she'd left something unfinished. That night, Rose lay in her bed beneath soft blankets, surrounded by warmth, safety, familiarity. Yet she stared at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the house that had once comforted her. She felt none of that comfort now. She saw Daniel instead, standing between her and Victor, eyes burning with a protectiveness no one had ever offered her. She saw the restraint in his trembling fist, the fear in his expression when she touched him, the man who believed he was made of storms, not understanding that she had seen the gentler seasons inside him. Soft tears warmed her cheeks. "Why did you leave?" she whispered into the dark, "when all I wanted was for you to stay." But the answer came as clearly as the wind rattling her window, because he didn't believe he deserved her. And Rose, with a trembling breath, realized something else. She was done letting others decide her worth, and she was not afraid of the ridge, not afraid of the man who lived there, not afraid of the life that waited if she was brave enough to reach for it. Spring reached Coldspire Ridge slowly, as if unsure it was welcome in a place built from stone and silence. The last snow had melted into dark veins along the rocks. Thin sunlight clung to the tops of the pines. Birds returned hesitantly, testing the air with fragile chirps. Daniel Clarke moved through this awakening world like a man unchanged. Inside the cabin, nothing looked different. The fire crackled. The wolves he had carved stared out from the mantel. His tools lay neatly arranged. Yet Daniel felt the absence of Rose in every breath, every shadow, every quiet dawn when he reached for a coat that no longer smelled faintly of her warmth. He had told himself solitude was safety, that pushing her away had protected them both. But the truth revealed itself each time he sat before the fire and felt the echo of her laughter lingering like a ghost in the wood grain. Daniel lasted through winter, barely. When the final frost loosened its grip and the path to Frost Hollow cleared, he prepared for his biannual trip to town. He packed hides, checked Thunder's reins, strapped his rifle to his back with the mechanical precision of ritual. This was the life he knew. This was the life he deserved. He opened the cabin door and stopped breathing. She stood at the bottom of the steps, Rose Merriweather, hands clasped before her, hair tousled by the long climb, cheeks flushed pink from cold and effort. Her dress fluttered lightly around her legs, her eyes warm, trembling. Filled with something that hollowed him completely, were fixed on him as if she'd been holding her breath for miles. Daniel didn't think, didn't breathe, didn't allow fear or restraint to find him. A single, soundless heartbeat pulsed between them before he moved. He crossed the distance in 2 long strides, hands reaching her before his mind caught up. He grabbed her shoulders with a gentleness that barely masked the tremor in his fingers. Then he pulled her into him, crushing her to his chest in a fierce, unrestrained embrace. Rose gasped softly, then melted against him, her arms threading around his waist, clinging to him like she had always belonged in the circle of his body. Daniel buried his face in her hair, breathing in the faint scent of pine and warmth and everything he had tried to forget. His voice cracked into her shoulder, raw and unguarded. "Rose," he whispered, the name cracking in his throat. "I came back," she said softly, "not because I was lost, but because I finally found where I want to be. He held her tighter. No hesitation, no fear, no control. Just Daniel finally breaking free of 10 years of silence and sorrow. Finally holding the woman who had walked back into his life like spring breaking through snow. And this time, he didn't let go.